Hello, everyone. We are starting. Can people online hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Yes.
I am delighted and honored to open this special joint seminar by the Department of History, General History, and the Haifa Center for German and European Studies. We have with us a distinguished guest, Professor Todd Herzog, who is professor in the School of Communication, Film, and Media Studies and the Department of Asian, East European, and German Studies at the University of Cincinnati, where he also directs the Niehoff Center for Film and Media Studies. He's author or editor of 6 books, most recently 25 Years Berlin Republic, which came out in 2019, and has published over 36 articles on topics ranging from the modernist crime story to the representation of history in the films of Quentin Tarantino. He's currently working on a collaborative book project on Vienna's Prater and the history of amusement. This talk is in fact first in and let's say, I wouldn't call it a project, but an attempt to strengthen the connections between the University of Cincinnati and the University of Haifa. So we are very grateful to the University of Cincinnati, who kindly contributed to this special visit. And we very much hope that this first visit of a University of Cincinnati professor will bring more in its wake. And thank you again, Todd, for making this long way. And we are looking forward to listening to your talk, which is titled Vienna's Prater and the History of Amusement.
Thanks so much, Sur, for that introduction. And thank you so much for the invitation to come here from the Department of General History and the Center for German and European Studies. It's really fantastic. This is my first time in Israel. It's a place I've wanted to come for, well, since I was a child. And so you guys made it happen. And that's great. I hope I can return the favor by giving a somewhat interesting talk. Also, thanks for filling up this room. I was warned that nobody might show up. I know it's a difficult day for that, but wow. So thank you all. I plan to talk maybe for about 45 minutes, if that works. And you know, you can interrupt me if you want. Remember, we have time to discuss afterwards as well. And this project, even though it's brand new, it actually goes back 17 years to the summer of 2006. My wife, Hillary Herzog, who's also a professor of German studies in the US, and I were living in Vienna that summer. And we had 2 small children who were 1 and 3 years old at the time. And so we spent a lot of time in the Prater, both the amusement park and the green spaces. And at the same time, Hillary was doing research on her book, which was eventually published and called Vienna is Different, which is about Jewish literature in Austria from the mid-19th century to the present. And she was noticing in her readings how many prominent Jewish intellectuals, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century, wrote about the Prater as a special place, right? So Theodor Herzog talked about how much he loved it there, and Josef Roth and Stefan Zweig, and of course Felix Salten did a whole book on the Wurstel Prater. And so we kind of took these 2 things together, the fact that this is important to Austrian writers and not just Jewish Austrian writers. And this was kind of important to us, and we said, hey, we should do something on this. Well, 17 years passed by, and we said, hey, let's do a project together. Why don't we return to that idea? So what you're going to hear is sort of the beginnings of a project. It's going to be collaborative. And I'm just going to sort of present what we're thinking about doing. I'm going to do sort of a presentation of the history of the Prater today. And then at the end, talk about a documentary film from 2007, sort of in some detail. So I appreciate any sort of advice, thoughts that you can, questions that you might have to help move this thing along. The Prater is one of Vienna's most iconic spaces. Its giant Ferris wheel stands alongside the Stephansdom as the architectural symbol of the city. Its tree-lined pathways invite visitors from near and far for weekend strolls. A ride on its narrow gauge railway, the Lilliputbahn, has been a rite of passage for Viennese children since the 1920s. Now, while other urban parks have played central roles in defining the cities they're situated in, I think that the Prater has played a uniquely important role in Viennese life since its establishment as a public space in the 18th century. And I'm going to have a lot of images here. One of the great things about studying this is there's just all these wonderful images actually available from the Wien Museum online, so they're easy to get. And I just picked here 3 postcards from the late 19th century, mid 20th century, and then present. And as you can see, the giant Ferris wheel, the Riesenrad, features prominently there, right, as a symbol of Vienna. The Prater was originally the hunting grounds of Austria's ruling family. It opened to the public, as we'll look into in detail in a bit, in 1766, and quickly became the center of Vienna's popular entertainment and amusement culture. In a city known for its rigid sense of tradition and hierarchy and emphasis on high culture, the Prater has consistently served as a countercultural space where people of all classes, cultures, and backgrounds can meet. It is, I hope to convince you, a unique and uniquely interesting space, a mixture of bucolic green areas and frenetic amusement park, a mixture of nostalgic past and modernist future that is once extraterritorial and quintessentially Austrian. Nearly every resident of Vienna has visited, and nearly every Viennese writer or artist has commented on it.
Todd, if I may just ask you to turn on your camera. Yeah. Go to the Zoom screen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Start video.
Yeah.
There I. Now, here's where I can sort of step back and ask, how many people have been to Vienna? Okay, have you been to the Prater in Vienna? Okay, anybody know it well, been there? Good, then you'll believe whatever I'm saying about it. Nevertheless, I'd like to start, even for those of you familiar with the city and the place, I'd like to start with looking at a map of the Prater, which is to get a sense of sort of where it fits geographically within the city. As it exists today, it's between the Danube River, which you can see that stripe across the top here, and the Danube Canal, this sort of brown stripe here as well, and is officially in Vienna's 2nd district, Leopoldstadt. Its main entrance lies about, let's see over, here's the 1st district, right there, about 2 kilometers away from the 1st district, from the Stephansdom. And it occupies about 6 square kilometers. So really the screen space from here up to this space here is the Prater down here. I say about 6 square kilometers. The walk down its central alley from the entrance at the Praterstern to the southernmost attraction, which is the former racetrack Freudenau, which is now a golf course, is just under 6 kilometers and takes a little over an hour to leisurely pace. As you can see, well, it's actually harder to see here because you see some of the stadiums in the middle. It varies in width and it's about 1.5 kilometers wide at its widest point. It ranks among the larger urban parks in Europe, somewhere 10th to 15th, slightly larger than Munich's Englischer Garten and about 3 times the size of Berlin's Tiergarten. Now, when people refer to the Prater, they're typically referring to one of 2 distinct areas within the conception of the Prater. In the next 2 slide, we'll zoom into these 2 sections. The first slide will be this section here, and then the second slide will be, well, you can see that pretty well here. The Northwest is home to the busy transit hub of Praterstern and the gateway to the area that is traditionally called the Wurstelprater, officially known as the Volksprater since the 1870s, but mostly people just call this the Prater. This is a part of the Prater that's home to the world's oldest urban amusement park, still in operation. It's densely populated with restaurants, attractions, and people, and has constantly evolved, as we'll see, over the past 250 years. The bulk of the park lies to the southwest and is much more pastoral, anchored by the 4.5 kilometer long Prater Hauptallee, which is lined with 2,500 chestnut trees and passes through meadows, ponds, and wooded areas. The so-called Green Prater, but most people would just call this the Prater, is a vibrant and diverse urban garden that has served as home to hundreds of species of animals, plants, and trees for centuries. So as you can see, the term Prater is used to refer to two very different but interconnected entities. The story of how we got from a green space adjacent to the center of Vienna, known for its animal life, to an entertainment hub and key symbol of a city that already has more than its fair share of landmarks, is the one that we want to tell in this project. Adalbert Stifter best captured the unique hybrid nature of the Prater as a space in his essay on Der Prater in 1844, and I've given me a quote here, and don't know how I can get that. That's not showing on my screen. I don't know how to get the Zoom thing off. Just notice that. I've got it minimized as much as I can. If it's not bothering you too much, we'll go through it. Okay, sorry. But as you can see, I've got the quote in German and then the English translation down here. I'll read all of the quotes in English. So I wrote 1844. Few capital cities in the world are able to exhibit such a thing as the Prater. Is it a park? No. Is it a meadow? No. Is it a garden? No. A forest? No. An amusement park? No. What then? All of these things gathered together. And I took a few liberties in what he calls a Lustanstalt, and I translate that as amusement park because it works for me. Today, I'm going to concentrate on the Wurstelprater. However, as the project evolves, we hope to find ways to integrate the Green Prater with the history of the Wurstelprater. So integrate these two spaces together in a way that there are no scholarly histories of the Prater that I've come across, and even the popular histories, they really just concentrate on what I'm going to concentrate on today. Concentrate on the history of the Wurstelprater from its beginnings to the present, tracking changes. What I'm going to do today, sorry, I lost my place, is concentrate on the history of the Wurstelprater from its beginnings to the present, tracking changes and continuities, and look at what I think is the most complex and interesting engagement with the history of the Prater, which is a film from 2007 by Ulrike Oettinger, the German filmmaker and documentarian, called Prater. Starting at the beginning, the earliest known mention of the Prater is in a deed from 1162, in which Emperor Frederick I, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, bequeaths an expanse of land along the Danube River to a man named Conrad de Prato in recognition of his faith and service to the empire. The document, which is written in Latin, names an area which is commonly called Pratum, quod vulgo dicitur Pratum, to be given over to this faithful Conrado, who is called Prato, qui dicitur de Prato. Now, Pratum is the Latin word for meadow, which is the generally agreed upon source from which the term Prater evolves. Although every Prater history repeats this story, I've never come across any reference to de Prato outside of this document from 1162, nor have I seen any speculation about the name's uncanny coincidence with the space he would inherit. Perhaps he gained the name de Prato in this document. I don't know, and there are medievalists in the room that maybe can help me with some of the conventions here. In any case, the boundaries of the Pratum as defined here are defined by the Schwenkath River and the Danube near the town of Mansvert. Today, that river is called the Schwekat, and the town is Mansvert, which means that it lies in the southeast area of what came to be called the Prater. I've done another sort of map here. So this is roughly the area going down to about this tip that defines the Prater. He was actually deeded the area that is more, it's hard to see in the resolution here, more down in this area. Right, so down near where the Schwekat airport in Vienna is nowadays. So this is what he's given. And if this is called, and this might have been more of a meadow than this sort of forested area here, the question is how the term that would have applied to this ended up being applied to that. And frankly, I have not been able to come across a history that does anything other than yada yada over that and say, well, in the 1500s, it was known as the Prater. And I simply haven't, because of the times, been able to do the archival work to see if those documents exist. Oh, and then I'm sorry, another map here. So this is a map from 1861, which attempts to reconstruct Vienna in 1147. It's not entirely to scale or accurate, but I think it's helpful here to see this is the walled city, and this would have been the south. The area would have been about 10 kilometers south of this. So if the Prater nowadays obviously has Vienna grown up around it, back then it would have been an area far away from the actual city, quite distant. Now, the area did change hands frequently in the coming centuries. and the name Prater, sometimes actually often spelled with two T's, increasingly referred not to the original area, but to that forested island to the northeast. In 1537, King Ferdinand I had an alley cut through the forest from his summer palace in the Augarten to his hunting camp, which was in the area in the Prater. This was the beginning of the Prater Hauptallee, which has since that time been lined with chestnut trees. He had the lining, the cheap trees put in. By 1560, the area roughly constituting the current boundaries of the Prater served as an imperial hunting ground. The left image here depicts the Prater wedding of Margareta Theresia and Leopold I on December 16th, 1666. That's that over there. That would have been one of the more meadowy areas, probably towards the southern part. The image on the right depicts the siege of Vienna less than 2 decades after that wedding celebration and shows the Prater, which I don't know if you can see, but here it's spelled with an O, P-R-O-T-E-R, as a strategic military island, a role that it would play in subsequent roles, most prominently the Napoleonic War and World War II as a site of battles. Now, one of the things I like about this map is it exaggerates the Danube Canal and therefore really emphasizes the island nature of the Prater, which you wouldn't really think of as an island. If those of you who visited probably wouldn't think of it. You have to cross water, but it seems like it's bounded to land as well. But I think that underlines an important point. As the city of Vienna grew up around the Prater, the two bodies of water that defined it prevented it from being woven into the fabric of the city in the way other urban parks were. Its geography made it a separately defined space within the city. Helping keep it separate was the fact that the area was off limits to the public until the 17th century, when at that point only members of the high nobility were permitted to ride their carriages down the boulevard only in the month of May, and provided they did not get out of those carriages. The area was open to the public by proclamation of Emperor Joseph II, which was published in the Wienerisches Diarium, the forerunner to the Wiener Zeitung, on April 7th, 1766. And I've put this up here, my translation of it. And I'm going to read it in whole because I think it actually makes some interesting points. It will be made known to everyone that out of the highest affection for the local public, His Imperial Majesty has most graciously decided that henceforth and from now on, at all times of the year and at all hours of the day, everyone, without exception, is free to walk, ride, and drive in the Prater, spelled now with a B and two T's, just so you could have another variation, as well as in the Stadtgut, which was the area just north of the Prater, not only in the main area, not only in the main avenue, but also on the side avenues, in the meadows, and on the squares, excepting the all too remote places in thick forests because of concerns over mischief and misuse. Also, nobody should be prevented from amusing themselves there with balloons, cone games, and other permitted entertainments of one's own pleasure, whereby, however, one ensures that in the course of such delights undertaken by the public in this most graciously bestowed freedom, nobody commits improprieties or other unpermitted debaucheries, thus giving cause for the greatest displeasure. It's worth noting here how the space, given how the space would evolve, that the emperor explicitly defines the Prater as a space of amusement and entertainment, as well as a space where all visitors, without exception, he adds, can move around freely. The setting of limits of propriety on those delights undertaken by the public almost encourages users to test those limits, which they did from the beginning. The emperor didn't want the Prater to become a libertine, all too libertine a space, but he clearly sees that as a possible outcome of his actions. Now, if it had stopped here, and this is always celebrates the birth of the modern Prater on April 7th, the Prater would likely have developed into a typical green space in the middle of a city, much like other former royal and imperial hunting grounds that turned into pleasure gardens and public parks. If you've been to Berlin, as I'm sure many of you have, think about the Tiergarten, which took down its fences in 1742 and opened to the public, so a few decades ahead of this. Or London's Hyde Park, which was publicly accessible by the middle of the 17th century. However, this is the point where the story takes a very Viennese twist. In the days after the emperor's proclamation, the Oberst Jägermeister, who oversaw the hunting grounds, asked the emperor whether tea, coffee, and other refreshments could be served in this new public space. The Viennese wanted a coffee house there, or at least a coffee tank. The emperor pondered this for a few days, and then on April 17th, 10 days after the initial proclamation, he authorized the construction of tents in the Prater, serving all manner of refreshments, adding wine and beer to the initial request for tea and coffee. The emperor's enthusiastic embrace of the space as a source of amusement and entertainment of food and drink, of open access to all people in all classes, set the Prater on course to evolve as it has in the years since. So April 7th, 2016 was the 250th anniversary of the Prater, and that's when it was celebrated. But I would argue that without the subsequent proclamation of April 17th, it would not have evolved in the direction it did, right? So that innocent question, and the emperor seemingly want to enthusiastically embrace this spot as a place of pleasure is, I think, important. And it evolved quickly, right? This was April 17th. Well, on May 1st, just 2 weeks after the allowance for tents, an entrepreneurial language teacher named Johann Dahmen applied for and received permission to erect a carousel, a slide, which is listed in the application as in the Dutch style. I don't know what a Dutch style slide is, but I'd love to find out someday. And a machine that simulates a sleigh ride in the newly open space. Others soon rushed to secure licenses for restaurants, for beer halls, for coffee houses, bowling alleys, and other amusements. A visitor from Cologne described the scene in the 1770s. In the woods and the main paths, there are beautifully painted huts in which one can have a very good lunch. And indeed, all refreshments can be had at reasonable prices. There are plentiful opportunities to play all sorts of games with skittles, large balls, small balls, and shuttlecocks, to ride on the swing and in horse races, etc., so that you can pass the time. By 1782, a map of the Prater, and that's the map there, the 1782 map, shows 47 buildings. 43 of them are restaurants. So these are hard to see here, but these are the names of them are given here, since it's the whole park area. And then this is the so-called Prater, the birth of the Prater, where the tents and now permanent buildings were set up. So 43 of them were restaurants, 2 merry-go-rounds, a camera obscura, and an exhibit of mechanical birds. It was to this part of the Prater, the Prater, home to the world's oldest urban amusement park, that Mephistopheles referred to when he exclaimed to Faust, "It's as much fun here as in the Prater." And he was talking about Walpurgisnacht at that point. The development of the Prater as a destination for amusement continued, with permanent structures increasingly replacing the makeshift tents of those first years. By the end of the 18th century, there were over 70 permanent structures, rising to 187 by the 1870s. During the 19th century, the Prater also became the frequent site of large-scale celebrations. So here's on the left, that's 1815, that's some of the coffee houses that opened up in the Prater Alley. And then here is Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth's wedding. The Prater became frequent site of large-scale celebrations and events. Emperor Franz Joseph I took a special liking to the Prater, inviting 200,000 guests to celebrate his marriage to Elizabeth on April 29th, 1854. And then he celebrated his birthday there every year, beginning in 1863, right? So it was both kind of a people's place, and then it was also a place for big imperial displays at the same time. It somehow coexisted. The early 1870s, as you might recall, it was a big rise in number of buildings there. It was a very important time for the Prater, because in preparation for the 1873 World's Fair, which would take place in Vienna, the Prater underwent a major transformation. This would be the first of several reconstructions of the Prater, as it sought to continually modernize. And it was the first time the development of the Prater would follow some sort of a plan, right? It was used kind of makeshift. The first century of the Prater's evolution was a result of entrepreneurial efforts to open establishments, and it had a strongly artisanal and organic feel, despite the frequent ceremonial events, which mostly took place in the green space of amusements and restaurants. Eager to impress the world, Vienna envisioned that the third European site for the World's Fair, after Paris and London, would showcase its amenities and elegance. The Prater, the World's Fair would actually take place, don't have a map here, but you've seen it enough times, right? In sort of in the green space of the Prater, they would build that. And then the existing space would be sort of the entertainment district. The Prater would serve as the entertainment amusement space for the exhibition. Organizers suggested that, this was funny to read in 1873, that the public's attention span had grown so short by 1873 that it was no longer sufficient to focus on educational elements of the exposition to the degree it had in other instantiations, and therefore placed greater emphasis on the entertainment section. This was mostly a modernization plan, so the dirt paths of the Prater gave way to asphalt paths. Gas lighting was added to sort of increase lighting at night. Some of the old buildings were demolished to make way for new ones, and the century-old tradition of regular fireworks displays dating back to the park's early years came to an end, because lighting off fireworks was a little too dangerous around the new buildings. The term Wurstelprater, which was a popular term used to describe this, and derived from these Hanswurst puppet shows, these sort of clown figure puppet shows that took place there in the early days, was given the official term Volksprater, which has literally never caught on to this day. The upscaling of the Prater attracted criticism from those nostalgic for the wilder days of the park's first century, and it began what we'll see as a cycle of gentrification, disintegration, and then controversial revitalization that would repeat itself in the years to come. The Wiener Illustrierte Extrablatt, sort of a popular paper, complained that, and here's a quote from that paper, the former Wurstelprater has been so nobly appointed and so elegantly furnished that for a long time now, the folk no longer trusted themselves to go to this Volksprater. The new Volksprater that we have received, but that nobody asked for, smells like cardboard, distinction, nobility, and asphalt. And sort of put a pin in that for a moment, because when we get to the early 2000s, we'll see if this story replays itself. Despite the opposition, however, the Wurstelprater continued to attract guests in big numbers. Indeed, the modernizations that the Wiener Illustrierte objected to paved the way for the rise of the Prater as a modern amusement park in the 20th century. One of the world's first theme parks, perhaps the first, Venice in Vienna, Venedig in Wien, opened in 1895. The theater director, Gabor Steiner, in partner with the librettist Ignaz Schnitzer, hired the architect Oskar Mamarek to oversee the construction of 3 squares filled with around 40 buildings, housing restaurants, shops, and amusements, and connected by a series of canals. You can see here this postcard of Venedig in Wien, Venice in Vienna over there. There's a postcard kind of showing the whole area, so you get a sense of what it looked like here, and then the top pictures of something else we'll get to in a moment. Mamarek had a couple years earlier recreated 17th century Vienna in a different location, which likely inspired the Austrian contribution at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair called Old Vienna, which was quite a hit at that very important 1893 World's Fair, which is often called sort of the World's Fair that sort of opened modern amusement culture. You might guess by now, I think that 20 years before that, in 1873, it actually took place in Vienna rather than Chicago. But the direct inspiration for Venice and Vienna was an exhibit that Steiner had attended a year earlier that had recreated Venice and London. The innovation here was to make it a permanent exhibition, so not a temporary show that people would attend, but a place that people would walk through and it would sort of live for a couple of years. It was really widely praised. The Wiener Bauindustriezeitung, the paper for the engineering and building industry, praised the exhibit for its restraint and not trying to recreate Vienna's iconic churches, squares, and palaces. In other words, you don't just see St. Mark's Cathedral and whatnot here, but rather creating typical Venetian residential buildings, which with attention to detail such as the characteristic chimneys. This was apparently a really well done recreation. The theme park was a great success, widely praised and well visited, and it helped to continue to propel the Prater to increasing glamour and importance, and inspired the common Viennese saying of the time, "Wir gehen heute Abend nach Venedig." Let's go to Venice tonight. 2 years later, the iconic Riesenrad, giant Ferris wheel, opened on occasion of the 50th anniversary of the reign of Kaiser Franz Joseph, who, as I mentioned before, really took a liking to the space. At the time, it was the world's largest Ferris wheel and attracted over 200,000 passengers in the very first year. The following year, Hugo Pilz opened what is probably, and this is now the upper left there, the building in the background. You can see with the more Gothic-oriented building. What is probably the world's first dark ride, adjacent to his restaurant Zum Walfisch. Visitors could ride a 600-meter-long track through a cave-like setting with scenes of the North Pole, the Witch's Kitchen, and other spectacularly recreated spaces. Now, of course, the ride on some level reproduced the travel theme of Venice and Vienna on a smaller scale, but also more mythical and magical scale. And the reason I'm lingering on this particular ride is because it has, I think, incredible historical importance. I think the term dark ride is only known to amusement park enthusiasts and historians, but it refers to any ride generally electrified, which goes through a dark area, and then you have projections or creations of scenes. The Tunnel of Love at Coney Island is usually seen as the world's first dark ride. This predated it. Disneyland's Haunted House, right, where you go through, and I'm sure you can think of, you've been on these dark rides, right, and some things. So what I'm sort of arguing here is at the time of by 1895, you have Yeah, by 1895, you have a dark ride, you have a world's biggest, right, Ferris wheel, you have a theme park, and you have amusements and refreshments. You have a modern day amusement park. I think there's no question about that. And the reason I'm arguing this so much is that in the relatively small, but I think interesting field of amusement park history, it is considered, I think, canon that Coney Island in New York was the world's first amusement park in the early 1900s. I honestly think that the Prater has all of those distinctions before that, and maybe other places do too, right? But I think if you look at the Prater, you've got a longer tradition. Most amusement park historians have a very strong Anglo-American bias, particularly an American bias, right? There was Coney Island, then the first theme park was the Disney theme parks. People talk about Vauxhall in England or Blackpool Beach. I think that continental Europe is neglected, as I'm sure other parts of the world. I know nothing about, for instance, Asian sites of amusement and so on, and could well predate this, but at least in the European tradition, I think the Prater is where the US and England would get a couple of years later, and therefore I think it's an interesting lost history, a lost place in the history of amusement. However, this was, the heyday lasted kind of like the heyday of the Habsburg Empire, only until the First World War. And after that, it became increasingly marked by, the Prater became increasingly marked by gambling halls, petty criminals, and sex workers. Not that this was a new look for the Prater. The earliest commentators in the 18th century frequently complained of loud beer halls and gambling establishments and the sex workers that were there from the very beginning. Indeed, the seedier side of the Prater was one of its attractions for visitors. There's a wonderful novella in the 1920s by Stefan Zweig called Fantastische Nacht, Fantastic Night, where his protagonist from sort of bourgeois Vienna goes to the Prater and experiences sort of danger and petty criminality and incredible liberation from, you know, his boring Viennese life. It's certainly something that I'd like to look at more in the course of this project. So by the 1920s, the cycle of glamorization and deglamorization, whose most recent phase began in 1873, was complete. Oh, thank you. The Prater was almost entirely destroyed in the Battle of Vienna. At the end of the Second World War, it was actually a site of a battle between German and Soviet tanks, as well as was bombed as well. A commentator wrote about the site, and you can see that here in an image on the left, which I'll talk about in a moment. A commentator wrote at the time, "No showplace or amusement booth has been preserved. The Bush Cinema, the roller coaster, the cave train, the ice cream parlor, the goulash hut of blessed memory, my God, nothing but rubble." The photographs Kurt Gerlach took in 1945, one of which is shown here on the left, starkly depict this destruction. The Riesenrad, which as you can see was damaged but not destroyed, returned to operation in 1947, and the entire park was largely rebuilt, funded by a successful campaign for public donations, Wieder Wiener Wurstelprater, Vienna Wurstelprater again, by 1953. So it was obviously a priority post-war rebuilding activity in Vienna. Thus began another cycle of rebuilding, this time mostly based more on nostalgia than a forward-looking plan. So the Praters existed after 1953, was new, but it wasn't a 20th century. Right. So 1953, actually, I believe that is the exact date, or at least within a year of when Walt Disney opened Disneyland in California. So the difference between what that was and what the Prater was recreating 1895. And so it was not rebuilt as a forward-looking amusement, not that it could have been done on the scale of Disney, but it was rebuilt as nostalgic, new, but still 19th century. And in a familiar story, the rebuilt Prater grew increasingly dingy and rough around the edges. The 1980 film, which is on the left, by Franz Novotny, Exit nur keine Panik, Exit but don't panic, tells the story of a young Stritzi. Stritzi is Wienerisch for a petty criminal and pimp, who dreams of owning an upscale coffee house, always a coffee house, but is caught in the world of small-time criminals. So the film clearly attempts to take viewers beyond the glamorous sights of Vienna, which at that time meant a lot of scenes in the Prater. Franz Josef and Sissy may have celebrated their wedding in the Prater way back when, but the attempt to rebrand post-World War II Vienna around Habsburg nostalgia had no place for the Prater in its current state. Which means, of course, it was time for the Prater to undergo a major redesign, as it had in the 1870s. Once again, the impetus was the park's hosting of an upcoming event, this time the 2008 European Football Championship, which took place in Switzerland and Austria. If my memory serves, Israel came very close to qualifying for that, but didn't quite make it, unfortunately. Ernst Happel Stadium, which would host the final, is located in the midsection of the Prater Park and actually was known as Prater Stadion until the 1990s. The situation was thus very analogous to the modernization of the 1870s, which saw the Prater as the entertainment zone for the World's Fair. This would be the entertainment zone for the Euros. It's worth going into some detail to see how it compares to the controversial first redesign. So the reaction was uniformly negative. Vienna's Wurstelprater, forwards into the past, quipped their Standard. Their falter was more direct. Mignon, du spinnst. Mignon, you're crazy. But the most powerful opposition came from the independent operators of the Wurstelprater's attraction. And this is interesting. Look at this from actually Mignon's firm's side. Mignon's firm's website, Happier World, describes the project as, quote, one of the most difficult and complex of the leisure industry. Remember, this guy worked for Disney, so that's saying something. It's the most complex project in the industry. The Prater, he continues, lost its glamour and appeal in the second half of the 20th century. The capital city owns the grounds and wanted to upgrade the Prater, but the decision power resides with the 80 tenants with unlimited rental contracts. I think this is fascinating. So remember, the very origin of the Prater was people raced to get contracts for original huts. And that, of course, developed over time, and like all capitalist projects, it consolidated into certain families and so on. But the actual individual, while the land was owned by the city of Vienna, the various attractions were owned by various individual owners and controlled, obviously, within regulations, what they could do. So even as of 2007, when you think this would have been completely consolidated, you had 80 different people that had to decide how the Prater would function. And of course, they had 80 different ideas. All of them were opposed to the kind of master plan that Vienna and Mignon would like to oppose. And in the end, frankly, the Prater proprietors won. And I kind of love the idea that the way the emperor opened this up in 1766, almost 250 years later, still dictated how the park would develop, right? And I think in the end for the better. So the Wurstelprater's distillation of power and reliance on entrepreneurial show people, that was his foundational act, ultimately thwarted the attempt to implement a master plan and kept the Prater mostly democratic and mostly chaotic. Nevertheless, the city did manage to implement some of these changes, though much less ambitious than the original plan. Among the 100 sub-projects that Mignon's firm cites are, again, quoting Happier World, new logo, enhanced theming, character, new sponsors, replacing weakest offers, site cleaning, international benchmarks. It sounds like every management plan, right? I'm sure the University of Haifa has a plan that has those words in it right now, as does my university and every other institution. Fortunately, as I said, the somewhat chaotic nature of the park remained, as have many of the classic rides and restaurants. You can still have Cevapici and Czech Budweiser at the Schweitzer House Garden. You can ride old school attractions such as the Geisterschloss, Haunted Castle Dark Ride. There's even still a cave ride, or I should say, once again, a cave ride. But of course, it's now named the Alt-Wiener Grottenbahn, right? So it's the old Vienna. And now you can also eat at Burger King and visit the Vienna outpost of Madame Tussauds, where you can walk through a 5D Sissy uncovered experience. I don't know what 5D is, and I don't think I'll ever find out by going to the uncovered experience. An article in the German paper Die Welt titled How the Prater Was Modernized to Death summarized the highly controversial project in these terms. The new entrance area of the amusement park, which is so rich in tradition, now exudes the cream-colored antiseptic charm of an outlet center, blended with set pieces of kitschy Vienna nostalgia. Faux facades and Baroque and Art Nouveau adorn giant concrete walls. The architecture critic of the Viennese newspaper Die Presse called it a nightmare and the greatest architectural gaffe in the last 50 years. I think that's a little bit of hyperbole, but parts of it, I mean, it's hard to see. I mean, you can see from, this is obviously a picture, this is a promotional picture taken by the Prater management. You can see it doesn't look anything like some of those earlier pictures. This is the entrance area. It gets a little bit shabbier as you move back a bit. That's again, promotional by the city of Vienna in the early days when they thought they were pointing to a new design. And that's a map of the Prater today, which is similar to what it had been before. I can now go on to something, if people are still with me here, This is going to be a little bit different, and I'd like to now really concentrate on this particular film that I mentioned and run through that in about 15 minutes or so, if that works. In the midst of the debate over the Prater redesign in the early 2000s, the German filmmaker Ulrike Oettinger, anyone familiar with Oettinger? No? Okay, great, yeah. She's a really interesting filmmaker, kind of forgotten of the sort of New German cinema and post-New German cinema, not entirely forgotten, but not as popular as some of the others. She did some really interesting fictional films and particularly interesting documentaries. And it's still a work as far as I know. So the film's difficult to classify. It's mostly a documentary with some staged and some fictional elements. In an impressionistic manner, Oettinger wrestles with the issues I've been highlighting here. The Prater is a weird space that exists outside of Vienna and its social divisions. The foundational commitment of the Prater to modern amusements that's in tension with a sense of nostalgia continually brought to it. And third, the cycle of gentrification, deterioration, and rebirth that's constantly repeated itself. In looking at this film, I want to think about the interplay between entertainment media, between film and the amusement park, as a way of thinking about the history of amusement that we've seen play out in the history of the Prater. Cinema and the Prater have had a close relationship from the earliest days of the medium. With its colorful performers, frequent parades down its tree-lined boulevards, and grand exhibitions, the Prater was a natural site for the early cinema of attractions. Right in 1895, the beginning days of the cinematograph, a lot of films were filmed in the Prater. It was just sort of a natural place to take your camera. Vienna's first cinemas, indeed some of the world's first cinemas, opened in the Prater as early as 1904. Many occupied buildings that had previously housed other attractions. So you find in 1904, 1905, that's when cinemas opened around the world, and the Prater was, right there with the very first wave of them. Many occupied buildings that had previously housed other attractions. For example, the Schaff Cinema opened in 1904, among the first, in Prater Hut 66. Remember, these huts are numbered, right? So number one, I actually don't know what number one was, right? But probably a restaurant or something. And then you have the like 1, 2, 3. So this was 66, which means it's been there since 1799, changing hands. So it opened in 1799, showing something called Naturmagie, nature magic. Again, you have to use your imagination, but I'm sure it was a visual experience, right, of the time century experience. In the mid-19th century, it changed to housing puppet shows. And so the transition to cinema in the early 1900s was natural, right? It was a showplace. Perhaps less expected is that when they rebuilt into a cinema, they also put in a giant slide and a carousel. As cinemas today struggle to attract audience and reinvent themselves as hybrid entertainment destinations, they could actually learn from the Prater in the early 1900s. Get to this in a second, but actually in 1926, when film became kind of a mature medium, and there were like a dozen cinemas in the Prater Hut 66 got rid of the film screen and put in an autodrome, which I grew up calling bumper cars, right, where you drive around an electric track and bump into each other, because cinema was old hat at that point, right? And driving cars into each other was the new amusement. And indeed, that's precisely why Oettinger brought her film crew to the Prater. A century later, the cinema and the amusement park would seem to have parted ways, and in many respects reverse their relationship. Film is no longer the upstart medium that arises out of the fairground and relies on it to reach a broad public. Rather, it is a mature, modern, and dominant entertainment form, while the traditional amusement park, such as the Prater, can be seen today as a relic of an earlier time. And this is the historical trajectory, is precisely what drew Ulrike Oettinger to the Prater as a subject of her film. And here's a quote. "What's fascinating about this place," she commented, "is how history, the cultural history of amusements, becomes astonishingly visible across classes, social strata, the spirit of the times, fashions, and technological developments and inventions." The film's difficult to classify. And here's some scenes from the film. It's a documentary, complete with interviews and wonderful archival footage, but it also contains stage scenes and is structured impressionistically, jumping around between times and topics without clearly delineating between them. I assume nobody is, well, you haven't seen this film, or have you? Yeah, it's very interesting. It's very worth seeing. An unnamed narrator who claims that every last nook of this tremendous amusement park belongs to me speaks a first-person text that combines historical facts, fantastic stories, and unattributed quotations from prominent figures such as Josef von Sternberg and Erich Kästner. Certain motifs, apes, cars, sideshow performers, are woven throughout the film, leaving the spectator to ponder the connections between these images. Now, what I'm going to do here is I've got two clips I'm going to show, one from the beginning and one from the end of the film. And I'm going to sort of play them while I sort of talk through and narrate them. So I'll play them without the sound. So we don't have to sort of pause to watch these. I'm hoping that the sound is off here. The film's opening sequence, a 4-minute long montage of the Prater's amusements, sets up a battle for control of representations between the Prater and Oettinger's camera. The camera frames its subjects clumsily, never from the angle from which they're intended to be viewed. We see a marionette's feet twice, a sideways monster disappearing into the far upper right corner of the frame, the reason rod about to be swallowed by or grabbed by demons. In all of this, the camera seeks to revision the attraction's repetitive movements and reframe the relationships to one another. Nothing is allowed to move in the way it is intended to. The camera moves subtly to control how we see the movements of objects that are in fact repeating themselves, often rotating in circles. The film's visual track asserts authority over its subject and dictates its representation as much as it can. And yet the soundtrack has a subject less under control. And since we're not listening to it, you have to believe me here. The diegetic sounds of the mechanical figures creaking and clinking can be constantly heard beneath the non-diegetic musical track. The film's first sounds are the clicks of the winking marionette. Later, they appear to be the taps of a finger on the dancing Pepe machine, but turn out to be Pepe himself, controlled by the human. Finally, the Prater seizes the soundtrack when an animatronic gorilla invites us to come on in. It is both an invitation and a challenge, enticing and frightening to the viewer and the filmmaker. Immediately after this invitation, the camera perspective changes dramatically. Whereas thus far studiously avoided accepting the views demanded by the Prater's amusements, it now sets itself up on a Ferris wheel. But we don't realize this at first. At this point, anyone knowledgeable in the history of representations of the Prater, and that certainly includes Oettinger, would expect to be treated to one of the point of view shots taken from a ride that are ubiquitous in Prater films. But this film refuses to do that. Rather, it struggles to make the movements of the camera, which are in fact tied to the movements of the roller coaster, look like a crane shot that surveys the Prater from above. It struggles to give the illusion of independence. At various times, however, the illusion breaks down. We just saw that happen as the camera's view is obscured by the points, by the machinery that manipulates it. On both the soundtrack and the image track, the film and the amusement park are competing for control. Oettinger and her camera are reluctant to succumb control to the Prater, but are unable to keep the Prater under control. In a key sequence later in the film, the questions of control become explicit. The film had been proceeding through its typical impressionistic form, using a horse balloon to explore the motif of horses in the Prater. Suddenly, in one of the film's dramatic set pieces begins, a text read by well-known author, Nobel laureate, Elfriede Jelinek. As a child, Jelinek tells us, and here she's pictured, she was able to roam freely in the Prater outside of the discipline imposed by her mother and her culture more generally. That freedom from authority came directly from submitting to the Prater, a space that, she said, quote, seemed itself to elude all control, and it threatened to take the young Jelinek, and again, quote, over the edge like an errant billiard ball. Meanwhile, the film juxtaposes disparate scenes. Jelinek reading her text, children past and present riding cars in the Prater, Jelinek embracing King Kong, that ape motif that runs through the whole thing, who's in charge. Issues of agency and control initially seem clear enough here. Jelinek is to submit either to the Prater in opposition to her mother, or to her mother in opposition to the Prater. But by the end of the text, the machines are instruments that the child uses to resist social discipline. No longer is the Prater the dangerous power that eludes control and threatens to send one over the edge. Rather, it is a net that rescues one out of the waters of conformity and discipline. The Prater offers, if only for a brief moment, respite from a world in which actions are closely scripted. After the Jelinek sequence, the film becomes stylistically different from earlier sequences. Shots are held much longer. Stories are allowed to play out. We watch a group of young men do battle with a punching bag from a stationary camera perspective, held long enough to make Michelle Haneke proud. We watch a couple as they prepare to be shot into the sky on an extreme amusement. He is sanguine. She is, in my opinion, quite properly scared out of her wits. But they both learn to enjoy the ride as something both frightening and yet aesthetically pleasing. right? And rather than say this in words, as I keep saying, sort of that danger and excitement come together, Jelinek really brilliantly shows it just in this clip of this couple. We watch a group of youth at first tentatively try to stand up on a centrifuge, then begin to master it by doing what? By putting themselves in sync with the movements, not trying to resist it and be like on solid ground. I'm going to do the same thing with this clip. Gone are the deliberately clumsy, this is the very end of the film, clumsy, repetitive movements of the beginning of the film. Gone are the camera's attempts to frame and control those movements. Gone are the frequent cuts to archival footage. Instead, we get circles of the centrifuge, which the riders gradually learn to negotiate, of a woman dancing at a club, of the swings. Cinema and the Prater seem to have found peace with each other. Oettinger and her camera have submitted to the movements of the Prater's amusements. Yet at the same time, this film masters the Prater by representing it. Recall the uncertainty between control and submission that Jelinek described in her childhood visits to the Prater. You are at once out of control, like a billiard ball, and in control, the attractions exist for your amusement. Both forms of amusement, cinema and the amusement park, demand a certain amount of submission from both the spectacle and the spectator, and both promise amusement in return. In an interview about this film, and here I'm wrapping up, Oettinger detailed what the cinema can learn from the Prater. Early cinema, she says, was a cinema of attractions, and it was born in the traveling carnival. It has much more to do with the Siamese twins of illusion and imagination than today's cinema does. The latter has become primarily a cinema of simulation, analogous to the arcades. The Prater never let go of amusement as illusion, imagination, and attraction. Oettinger's documentary reminds us that the Prater itself has always been a cinematic experience. Like cinema, it is a dream machine, a desire machine, a memory machine, and a time machine. Like cinema, it's a space of romance, danger, and the uncanny that can thrill, seduce, and frighten its spectators, usually all at once. The power dynamic of the beginning of the film is reversed by the end of the film. Cinema learns from the amusement park. Oettinger's documentary also reminds us of what cinema used to be and what it can still be: an attraction, an amusement, a cinema of, to adopt Tom Gunning's terms, exhibitionist confrontation rather than diegetic absorption. Oettinger's cultural history of amusements is one of continuity for the Prater, which has always been instrumental in the history of amusements, and a return to origins for the cinema. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Todd, for this panoramic and the view that goes back in time and discusses the present. And I'm sure we've found each one parallels in our own experiences. Let's open the floor to discussion. We have enough time. We will start with a round of questions here, and in the meanwhile, viewers online can either raise a hand on Zoom or type their question into in the chat box. So, questions, remarks, ideas. Katerina and then Mark.
Thank you so much. It was really, really interesting. While you were like, you started like in 1766.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about the concept of amusement in this time. So would be interesting to know who would go in this time to the Prater. Is it like the city elite, or is it with the farmers going back? Or what's the concept of amusement? Like who went in this time? Like in this later time, I can understand.
Yeah.
You know, did you also look into it? It was the audience when the gates first opened?
It really was both. And it was, in the beginning, was very much divided by space. So that the noble spaces were the area to the south, right? And that's where you had the fancy restaurants open up. And then the area in the north, which becomes this amusement park, that's the more downscale spaces. What I don't know, I don't think there was much mixing in the 18th century, right? So it was mixing in the space of the Prater, and theoretically everything was open to everybody, but I think it was still largely self-segregated. That definitely breaks down later on. I talked about that, this is many years later, that the Zweig piece where the bourgeois person deliberately goes to the downscale person. That already started in the early days. At the same time, the Prater became known as a space for these, I guess there were these sort of traveling libertines throughout Europe, and they had their own almanac. They called themselves nymphs, and they would just go around. The Prater became known as a great destination for doing whatever you wanted, right? Because of all the sort of dark spaces. But still, I think it was, even though the people were next to each other, I think that they were still more or less separate. But that being said, right, I'm relying at this point on the popular histories that have been written, which very much go from a position of nostalgia, and have not been able to do much archival work because the last couple of years, I'd love to look at sort of who applies for permits and when. I'm guessing that they still have those records. And in terms of visitation, because there were no sort of check-ins or whatever, right? I don't know if we could figure it out, but we could look at sort of newspapers from the time and so on. So that's a long way of saying everyone really did visit from the beginning as the emperor had determined, but they had their separate worlds. It was a big enough area to do that.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. And in the beginning of your history with Joseph II, it's interesting that so much attention is given to basically social control and the dangers of too much fun and uncontrolled sort of amusement and so on. So, I mean, I think this speaks to also to Katarina's question that the park is also about, giving space and leisure and the rise of the modern bourgeoisie, but it's also a way of sort of containing the masses and making sure that they are somehow monitored and not just giving outlets to their, social drives out there in the streets. So I wonder if you could add somehow more of a, situate the role of this space within the emergence of more centralized states and surveillance in some ways. And so
that's a great question. I just took a note that I think that's a great observation. Yeah, right. It's on the one hand, it's knowing that these things are going to take place, so let's limit them to this space. I think it's definitely that. In terms of policing, I know a little bit that they had these patrols that would go through the Prater and try to police it from the beginning. And I just get sort of a few complaints, right, that they're kicking people out for that. I don't know any of the details. That's something that I think we'll have to look into. But I love that idea that taking this space and making it basically permanent carnival, right? But then also containing it, limiting it. I think that's great. Thanks for the observation. I'd love to pursue that more. I think that's a good one.
We have Nati and then Matthew.
A couple of hands up online too.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do you think it gave an inspiration to the great exhibitions later on in the 1850s in Paris, London?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I doubt it. Because I think that they were more. That's a good question. I don't know, but my guess is they sought their inspirations elsewhere, in that they were sort of grander educational exhibitions. But that's an interesting one to look at. I know in terms of amusement park history, as I mentioned, that 1893 Chicago World's Fair is generally seen as an important moment. I know less about the Paris and London World's Fairs and where they derive their interest, but again, I'll take a note to look into that. Yeah, because it certainly had a European-wide reputation at that point. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Fantastic talk. I had two small questions. The questions. The first was that you framed your inquiry in terms of history of amusement, but what about the environmental history of the Prater?
Yeah.
Is this something you're willing to address alongside the lines that you've developed? And the second question is, I heard you say the word extraterritorial at the beginning of your talk, and it reminded me of a movie of which you showed a still, which is the Third Man, which is this very specific period of time, the Cold War, Vienna during the Cold War, when the Prater would also be used as some sort of gray area where all sort of things could happen, like spying, etc., etc. So could you elaborate a bit on this very specific time period?
Yeah, fantastic. Two great questions. The first one is, I think that this needs to be fit into sort of urban green space history, landscape history. I'm collecting texts as I come across them, right? And it's something that like everything else. I mean, there's actually a wonderful book on green spaces in Vienna, which is, I think, from the 80s, which gives like 3 sentences to the Prater. So even there, it's been neglected. But I think this history of urban green spaces, I think again, it's something I'm trying to collect information on right now. There was an Institute for Experimental Biology on the Prater Hauptallee, which was apparently one of the more important biological institutes that did work sort of on the Prater, was largely Jewish and therefore was destroyed by the Nazis after the Anschluss. But I mean, I'd like to trace the history of that place. And then people write entire articles about certain flowers they find in the Prater and so on. So
And animals.
and animals, exactly. So I think that's really, really crucial, how to integrate that into this. But definitely that's our plan, is to do that. On the Third Man, yeah, I mean, that's probably the most iconic scene, right? You guys mostly know this. The history of crime in the Prater is actually an interesting one from the earliest days to now. But in that particular one, it follows this pattern, right? The Prater as this space where anything can happen. And are people familiar with the Third Man and this scene? So, right, tell spies and crime. Orson Welles plays Harry Lime, who is selling bad penicillin, right? That's killing children. And his former friend Holly Martins comes to visit him, and intrigue ensues. And there's a famous scene at the Riesenrad, which would have been this was 49, I think 49. Yeah. So
That really is the part.
it really is, because it had opened, the Riesenrad was there, and so the whole Prater hadn't worked, but it really was there. And recall that Orson Welles' character is telling Holly Lime of all of his crimes and why they don't matter. And they look down and they see all these, he calls them little dots, right? This idea that sort of they're there. And then, and this really speaks to what you were saying, when Holly says, well, you'll be arrested. And Harry Lime says, that jail's in another zone, which is literally true in divided Vienna. But I think it's also metaphorically true for what you say. It's like, no, we're in the Prater right now. There's no jail here. And I think that's definitely there. And it predates the Cold War, and it postdates the Cold War as this space where sort of crime can exist within certain, there's mostly petty criminals. But yeah, thinking about the Prater, and I'll be honest, I know very little about divided Vienna, right? It was very different from divided Berlin, obviously. And this was in the Western zone, I believe. Yeah. But that's good, sort of looking at that. Did you have thoughts on the Cold War? Yeah.
Just a huge fan of the movie.
Yeah.
And I happen to be interested in this kind of gray areas or shady zones in the urban space where that are kind of specifically devoted at certain points to shady activities. So I'd be saying
I think and it would be interesting to compare that, because I haven't looked into specifically with Graham Greene's novel and how the Prater is used there versus, again, this great use in the film. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, we'll take 2 questions here, and then 2 questions online, and return to the table. Daniel, and then Walter, and then Zoom, and then Mira. Okay. Okay.
Thank you very much for that fascinating talk. I was wondering how far you look and can say something about which role the Prater played in Viennese or Habsburg and later Austrian self-representation, what role it plays, for Austrian nationalism. I could imagine that it plays a role first for the Habsburg, the monarchs, but later on also in the nationalist realm on the one hand, and on the other, you mentioned paper articles, which will, how foreigners or how the Prater is looked at by, German, French, Americans. An idea would also be, if you haven't done it, to look at travel guides, right?
Yeah.
Where it might tell you a lot about, how people perceive Austria and how the street is.
I think that's a great idea. That's I've noted that down too. I've only looked at a handful of early travel guides, right? There's like these one for the so-called nymphs and so on. But that would be a great idea. So I don't have a good answer for you on how to look at from the outside, but I think that'd be very interesting. As far as self-presentation, you had these ceremonies, these festivals, right? That I mentioned. There were a lot of them that we could. There was the Congress of Vienna, celebrated with I forget, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, the battle, right? The last Napoleonic War battle that had been won, and that became a space of that. But I think really interesting in Empire's self-presentation. I briefly mentioned this place, the Schweitzer House, right? The Swiss house, which I believe has nothing to do and never had anything to do with Switzerland. But they're famous for their menu, which would include Wiener Schnitzel, Cevapcici, and Czech beer, right? So you already can see here the house. I'm sure that they had an espresso from Northern Italy and probably some goulash or something, right? Just to round out the empire. But this idea that the empire is representing itself in food. Another thing that I think is interesting is the Prater is a space where migrants from other parts of the empire could come for employment. The food for sure, right? So the food was there, and I'd like to, again, hope they're archived. I'd like to take a look at the menus, right? And that's something I haven't been able to do yet, but hopefully we can do that. But the other thing is performers. I barely mentioned that. But one of the important elements of the Prater is these roving performers, a lot of which were sideshow stuff and so on, and they would come from everywhere. One of the most famous early ones was from Italy, and then they came from the East and so on. So you literally had people. It was a space where migrants could sort of work and be accepted as part of, I think, again, as part of the empire. What would be interesting, which I don't know, is sort of that self-presentation beyond the ceremonies and beyond the postcards or whatever of this as a space that is, that represents the empire. But it really was, again, one has a tendency to get nostalgic about the Habsburg Empire as this place where people really got along and, multicultural, multinational, multi-ethnic. And some part of that's true, and I can imagine the Prater could serve as that kind of space, but obviously there are also many, many issues there. In terms of Prater, people could buy Prater places. Again, I want to look at the applications, but I do know that as of 1938, about a third of the owners had their property stolen in the Anschluss. I assume most of them were Jewish, but others. And so, so it was clearly a place where quote unquote non-Aryans were predominant. But again, I don't think there's been a good history of that, so I don't know who they were and where they came from.
Yeah, thank you. What a wonderful nexus for so many topics. I was just wondering, it's so easy to talk about this in sort of Bacchian terms, obviously, but I wondered if you had any thoughts about the Prater and the history of dreaming, because Vienna is such an important place for dreams. And I was just thinking about Eyes Wide Shut, which is based on a Viennese, early 20th century Viennese novel, which is also about, I think, sort of wandering. I haven't read it, but it's also about kind of wandering out into the city, into places where a respectable person doesn't go. Just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I think that's interesting. Space for dreaming, yeah. I hadn't thought of it in those terms. I'm just trying to think. So I know Schnitzler was one of those authors who definitely liked the Prater and wrote about it. I don't know, it's been a long time since I've read it, whether it's mentioned in Traumnovelle, which, right, it does take place in Vienna, unlike Eyes Wide Shut in New York. But I'll sort of look at that. Beyond that, yeah, I mean, you have, so A Dark Ride in many ways is a dream, right? A dream simulation, because you are going into the dark and you're seeing these disconnected images, right? So in that Grottenbahn, the cave train, you would go to the North Pole and then you were in the witch's kitchen. And so I can imagine that. What I don't know is whether, I don't know whether Freud visited the Prater, and if he did, if he made anything of it, but that's certainly something to look at.
The other thing I was thinking of was with a rare bit, the cartoonist Winsor McKay, who did Gertie the Dinosaur, was much more famous for this early cartoon. Was very much this sort of matrix of like in the sort of like cartoon. I don't know. I think there was a connection that came that people at the turn of the
Interesting. Yeah, I'll look into that, because I, like everyone else, I know McKay from Gertie more than that nowadays.
I mean, another person coming out of this sort of carnival space.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, good. Alisa, would you like to speak to us, maybe?
Yeah, hi everyone. Todd, my question is from sort of an urban history point of view. I was wondering I don't know a lot about Vienna in particular, but it strikes me as a city that has a really complicated relationship between its history and modernity, right? Trying to appear modern, certainly more so than maybe Chicago and like when Chicago had the World's Fair, for example. So I was wondering, you talked about these cycles of revitalization, which were really interesting. I wonder if it's too much to say that, you know, could one use the Prater and the history of the Prater to sort of gauge Vienna's self-image as a modern city versus a city defined by its history, right? Because as I was noticing, the times when revitalization happens along modern lines, like it's what you'd expect almost, the 1870s, and then nostalgia, right? Like after World War II, you would expect this too. And even the attraction of the seediness, right? Like the, you know, less desirable parts. It reminded me almost of like Victorian England, right? And their obsession with crime and, you know, East London, that kind of thing. So yeah, I wonder if it's too much to say, like, could you sort of use the Prater as a way of gauging how Vienna sees itself in this complicated relationship?
Yeah. Yes, we got that. Yeah, and I think that's a really great observation and a question. I think certainly after World War II, it's either neglected or it's purely nostalgic, right? So you either have the nostalgia end or you neglect it. But I like that idea that it's almost that part of, again, and get back to your notion, contained. Right? Was you pointed out this idea sort of contained within this area that you could go and sort of visit petty crime, right? And then go back to the nice stuff. I mean, you see, yeah, I think you're right. In 1873, right, Vienna definitely wants to be a modern city. In any time after 1945, anyway, it wants to still be the 1870s. Right. So I wonder if there's ways, and I don't know the answer to this, to wonder ways in which the Prater is an alternative. I think that's what you're getting, an alternative to that kind of nostalgic representation, right? Later on. Yeah. No, it's a great thought. I've written it down. And when I come back in 2 years, I'll have all answers to all these questions. But thanks a lot, Alyssa. That's great.
And another question online from Alina.
Hello. I wanted to ask about the moment that the decision was made to open the doors for the public, because it's quite a decision, right? You have the imperial lands, you said they were used for hunting, right? And then that decision is made, which is quite radical, especially right 1788, right? To open the doors and open the doors for the people. Were these like political motivations to calm down the crowds because revolutionary thoughts were going around? Or was it something of a, like, should we look for a cynical reason, or was it just really a goodwill? Let's people have some space for fun. Like, what's your view on that?
Well, we should always look for a cynical reason, I think. There. I think it's both. I honestly don't know whether the documentation exists to see what the emperor was thinking about when he did this.
But
and I also don't know that there were any, there were some demands to open up areas to the people, right? I mean, yes, this was the mid 1770s, mid 1700s. If you think, I'd have to look at other ones too, right? I mentioned that the Tiergarten opened in the 1740s. So my guess is this was something that was happening around Europe. And so maybe Austria just kind of got on with that. But I don't know to what I don't know is the extent to which people were demanding this and protesting to be let into these spaces. Is something I'd have to look up.
Do we think maybe it was something like as a maneuver to engage them with that, and for them not to think about other things, a kind of a diversion in a way? Just with the historical context of the time, I'm not quite sure what was happening in 18th century Austria at the time.
sexual activity of prostitutes or even illicit heterosexual couples or homosexual couples?
Yeah, good question. On the first one, yes, day one. Right, day one, it was a site, it was known as a site of prostitution. Up till, I don't know about the present, but at least up until the recent past. Right, so it's always been associated with that. And you can even see in the Emperor's Proclamation where he's kind of expecting that and saying, "I don't," right? But also do that. Oh, as far as other types of non-heteronormative sexuality, that I honestly don't know. In the way in which other groups, Joseph Roth says, when I go to the Prater, I see that the anti-Semite's no longer an anti-Semite, and then when I walk outside, he's an anti-Semite again. I wonder whether that goes for other groups, right? I think the migrants already mentioned from other places, but for same-sex couples, I don't know, but I'm going to make a note to find that one out. So sexuality and prostitution, absolutely, from day one, as being sort of maybe a haven where people could be out in a way they could with other identities. I don't know. Or even sexual fluidity is part of this, like the carnival atmosphere anyway. So maybe that's an idea, sort of performing that and celebrating that in a way it would be condemned outside. So that's for sure. And that wouldn't be unique to the Prater, though. That would be the circus.
But was sex was it an amusement? I'm not sure.
Right.
Now it's an amusement, but then it was something else.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. Good. Thank you.
I'd like to ask about the park as a colonial space or colonial display space. I mean, both in terms of maybe natural history, exotic species. Was there a zoo at some point in the park? Because you said there was hunting previously, but also a kind of an ethnographic display. If you could say some more about that.
Absolutely. So there was a zoo kind of, when we define, so adjacent to the official borders of the Prater, but in some level who's counting us on that side of the river. And I don't have the year, it might have been the 1870s as well. Around that time, there was put on display what was called the Ashanti village. And this was a group of Africans who were brought in to be on display in the zoo. And it's important. This is something that some historians have written about. Peter Altenberg actually wrote, even at the time, he wrote a piece called Ashanti. So there's definitely that, right? So that's just straightforward colonial racism, right? Bringing them into the village and looking at that. Beyond that, one wonders about is after 1918, the extent to which the Austrian Empire is still being imagined. That would be a form of perhaps retrospective colonialism, right? Trying to sort of continue to claim the old Habsburg lands somehow. But yeah, so there's certainly those moments. The Ashanti thing is the big one, the sort of the colonial display. And I wonder about maybe some of the other sort of more official displays, whether they ran into that as well. But that's definitely one where you had that, yeah. And whether, it's a different type of colonial, but whether, one thing I don't know about the Prater as a green space is whether non-native plants were put in there, or whether it was, that I don't know, right? But that would be an interesting thing if they brought back plants or animals. Certainly the zoo.
Okay.